All right, well, I guess it's time to start. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us tonight for the latest installment of Novel at Home, a series of virtual author events, bringing authors to your living room or home office or wherever you're Zooming these days. Your support is so valuable to a small business like ours, especially in challenging times like these, and we thank you for being with us. Tonight, we welcome featured author, Memphis native Sidney Thompson, in conversation with Memphis-based radio personality, motivational speaker, and educator, Kristee Lane. Fun fact, or at least interesting fact, since there wasn't much fun about this time last year, but Sidney was one of the very last in-person events that we hosted in store, the first book of the Bass Reeves trilogy. I remember that he was close, and I double-checked myself. In fact, it was the weekend before, the world shut down. Y'all all remember that week, I'm sure. So anyway, while we miss those days of gathering in person together, we're grateful to have technology to bridge the gap. And I do have faith that we'll be together again before too much longer. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. After I introduce our guests, I'll hide my video during their conversation. I'd ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom rather than the chat to ask questions you might have for them. They should have time towards the end of their conversation to get to audience questions, and direct those to the Q&A would be ideal. You can enter those at any time. You don't have to wait till the end. So go ahead and enter those questions as you have them, and Sidney and Kristee will get to them at the end of the conversation. I'll be in the chat to answer any questions you might have, and I'll also post links to purchase Hell on the Border from Novel online. Without further delay, it's my honor to formally introduce tonight's guests. Kristee Lane is a mother, educator, speaker, radio personality, life coach for parents, and the founder of 7 Principles of WOW, which stands for Women of Worth and Wonder, an organization that is focused on providing information and support to women. Lane received her Bachelor of Science degree in Organizational Management from Bethel University and her MBA in Marketing from Strayer University. While hosting a local radio show on 103.5 FM here in Memphis and working as a broadcast instructor for Shelby County Schools, this Memphis native spends her days in the classroom at Germantown High School, molding and shaping young minds. Sidney Thompson is a native Memphian and proud alumnus of Campus School, Wooddale High, and the University of Memphis. He holds a PhD in American Literature with a specialization in African American narratives and an MFA in creative writing. He's the author of 3 works of fiction, including Sideshow, an interestingly named collection of short stories set in his hometown of Memphis, Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, which is the first book in the Bass Reeves trilogy, and finally his latest, published earlier this month, Hell on the Border, the 2nd volume in the Bass Reeves trilogy. Can't wait to hear their conversation today. So happy you're all here with us. Please join me in giving our guests a warm virtual welcome.
Yay! Well, all right, let's get started. Sidney, I have looked forward to this conversation. So much to talk about. First of all, the books are fabulous. I enjoyed both, all 3. I enjoyed everything that you've written. But let's start off here. Let's start off at the very beginning. How did you even get interested in African American literature, history, the whole journey? Just tell us a little bit about your background and bringing it to the Bass Reeves story.
I love that question, and thank you, Kristee, for joining me today. It means a lot. It's an honor. I hate to take us all the way back to the beginning of my life, but truly that's where it starts. My father taught what was called at that time in the 70s, Black English, and his best friend was a famous rhetorician, famous scholar at Lemoyne College, and they wrote papers together and presented at conferences internationally. He went to DC with her and met Martin Luther King Jr. in the elevator. They were in the same hotel. different conferences, of course. But I just grew up hearing about the literature, about the importance of the civil rights movement. Of course, I'm living in Memphis. I'm 3 years old. I'm too young to go to Mason Temple, but my father takes my older brother, and they hear the famous mountaintop speech the night before he was unfortunately killed there in Memphis. So I grew up in the shadows of these, I mean, just hearing these stories, the importance of Black history, Black culture. And I guess I grew up with a responsibility to make sure fellow white people knew that it was our culture and history too. It's not just for the other. And I went to public schools that were majority Black. Thankfully, my parents didn't follow so many of their peers and rip us out of the city with the white flight. And so many of my friendships, and I mean, majority of my best friendships were with Black people. So I just fell in love or felt familiar or comfortable with the history, the culture, the rhythms of the dialect. And I've always just been fond of the music, the literature, etc. And I've got a nephew who's Black. My older brother adopted a half Native American.
Okay.
So I just feel as an uncle, as a white person, if it's to use my white privilege for good as opposed to evil, I just want to be a part of the discussion. And so now I'm flashing forward to the more present reason why I chose this to first learned about this story and chose to write about it, about Bass Reeves. I heard Morgan Freeman on television. He was in an interview on CNN. He was asked, "What's your dream role?" And he said, "Well, there's this guy, Bass Reeves. He was the most accomplished lawman of the Old West. Nobody's ever heard of him. And I mean, when I say most accomplished, that may sound like what does that mean? Well, so he was ambidextrous. He was an expert marksman with a pistol and rifle, both with his right and his left. He was such an expert that he was banned from turkey shoots when he was enslaved. This is before the Civil War. His master would make money off of entering him turkey shoots. So he would win these contests and the master would take the money. But when I hear about this guy and I wonder, well, how is he unknown to us? How could he have been whitewashed from history? I do a little homework and I realized, well, Morgan Freeman wanted to do this guy. That's his dream role. And I realized that he became my dream story. I'm a storyteller. I see that no one has written his story. There's a great book of scholarship by Art Burton. And Art Burton, great historian, African-American who grew up in Oklahoma, hearing the stories, kind of the legends, growing up in Oklahoma about Bass Reeves and wanted to bring his name to light. And so I read his book and got engrossed and thought the historical documents that kind of gave these pieces to the puzzle of Bass Reeves' story, I wanted to kind of piece them together and try to tell a story that we could follow, so we could root for him and so he could become a part of our canon and our national story the way he should be. The way he once was in his lifetime is very heroic, but he should be a hero today. And I'm hoping he'll become a household name like Wyatt Earp or Billy the Kid. He deserves it.
He does. One of the things I noticed in the book, you mentioned early on that you love the dialect. One of the things that stood out to me in your book was the dialect and how you closely you were able to capture it and express it. Now, let's address this before we go any further. You chose to use the N word in the book, although it's, I guess, abbreviated. It's not the full word. Let's talk about why you did that, why you felt it was important to keep it, especially from that era of being of master and enslaved individuals. That was a word that was used as a normal word. It didn't have any negative, socially it was acceptable. So explain to me how and why you came up with, you know what, I'm gonna go for it. It's a part of the culture back in that day. So talk us through that.
Sure. As a writer of historical fiction, I felt, due to verisimilitude, that I needed to capture the culture, the way people talked, the way people behaved. And my publisher said, well, we can't have this word in here. And we kind of compromised, said, well, the N, call it the N word, N, underscore,
Right.
underline, you fill in the blank if you wish. Because ultimately, I think if you don't use the word, I feel like you're erasing some of the horror. I think that even though that word was used so commonly then, it almost didn't have much of an effect with some people. Nowadays it does.
Right.
And I feel like that's one way literature can remind us of how visceral, how ugly, how violent white people were, and how insidious they were in terms of saying it so commonly, that word, to demean their slaves, that the slaves would sometimes use it themselves. And why I have slaves and as characters say it sometimes too is part of the history of how the dominant culture, white people, the master class, how they psychologically pervaded them so that they could grow to think maybe I'm inferior. And that was part of the insidious nature of slavery, of working on people psychologically like that. So I thought that was part of the story to tell. And Bass Reeves, I try to make sure that his psyche matures and he starts to see how they're trying to manipulate his thinking. And he sees it.
He does.
And he starts to use that word less and less as his psyche grows, and he starts to understand what the white people are doing and starts to he learns how to turn the tables on them.
One of the things I realized early on in your book about books about Bass Reeves is how intelligent he was. He was a silent, smart man. He psychologically, he was able to outthink his situation. And how did you capture that? How did you create that? With your research, is that true to who he was? Is that what you found? Because it was many occasions in the book that they thought he was stupid or just didn't get it, when he clearly got the conversation, but he chose to take it a different route because it was safer and because he knew he had an end result of doing something else. He knew he would.
Right.
He was bigger than that moment.
Well, okay, so here he was in a better position than most enslaved individuals.
Right.
For the fact that he was a house slave, so to speak. So he did work the fields as a young child, but his mother worked in the house as the servant to the mistress, the master's wife, and then he became the servant, the personal servant for the master. And so when you're close to the position of power, you get to learn some of that. That power can rub off on you if you are observant. And because he was in a favored family, his aunt was also a prominent slave on the plantation as a seamstress. And then so his mother, and then his grandfather was favored as well. That I thought that helped explain how he could survive so well and be treated so well by his masters, that and benefit from, you know, being taught how to shoot a gun, that he was trusted that much. And then when his master goes to the Civil War, he's the body servant, so he attends the Civil War with his master, so he's entrusted a great deal. So they had to believe that he was intelligent, and I have to believe that he was intelligent, not only for those reasons, but after he escapes slavery and he hides out in Indian Territory or present-day Oklahoma, he learns all of the languages of the 5 civilized tribes, as we call them: the Cherokee, the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminoles. He learned their languages. Now here's an illiterate man who never learned to read, but he could learn all these languages. And he was so creative that when he was a lawman later on, beginning in 1875, that he understood that he could use his race to his advantage, that white outlaws, black outlaws, anyone, they wouldn't expect a black lawman. So, all right, I'll use that to my advantage, and they won't see me coming, and I won't need to go in guns blazing and announce, hey, I'm the law. I'll just slip in, I'll get up beside them, I'll pretend to be a tramp or a cowboy or whoever. One time it's reported that he dressed as a woman. But so he became a master of disguises, somebody that clever and smart. Because I felt like that gave me the opening of seeing what he could have been when he was a slave. And that's what really informed me for his personality, for him to bide his time, gather information. And that's what he did as a lawman. He would kind of observe a situation and long enough so that he would strike when it was safe, when it was safer for him, and in hopes that he wouldn't have to resort to violence and make his capture instead of killing somebody. That was ultimately his goal.
And he was so brilliant about it. I mean, the character and the person was so brilliant about outthinking and using the fact that he was an African American, and people wouldn't even suspect or even think twice about him being a law person. That was something I found very intriguing and very interesting. Speaking of that and the cowboy and all of the above, the fact that it's believed that the story, The Lone Ranger, is really based off of Bass Reeves. How true is that? How credible is that information?
All right, so Art Burton, the scholar I mentioned earlier, he wrote a book called Black Gun, Silver Star about Bass Reeves. I believe it was in 2006. And that's how Morgan Freeman learned about Bass Reeves. I mean, nobody had heard about him until that book came out. And that's how I've learned more about him. So he poses this theory. We don't know for sure. We don't have any information that the radio creators of Lone Ranger had heard about Bass Reeves, and there was information out there. There were old newspaper store, clippings, and there were old books out of print, but still you could read them. So it's possible that they learned about Bass Reeves. But there are so many interesting similarities. All right, so the Lone Ranger preferred to shoot only in self-defense, preferred nonviolence, and that seems so original as Jesus Christ and Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, the turn the other cheek. You know, you try anything you can before you go that severe step of violence. Let's try the peaceful route first. That's what Bass Reeves did. He was so far ahead of his time that he preferred to arrest and kill only if he had to. That's why he was able to have a career that lasted 32 years instead of the average that was like a year, two max, you know, like for Wyatt Earp. So Bass Reeves had a fondness for silver. He would and I incorporate this in Hell on the Border as a lawman. When he pays people, or he tips them, he gives them a silver dollar, and that was his trademark. Also, the Lone Ranger has a Native American sidekick because he's going around Indian territory or Native American territory, and he might need a scout who knows the land well and might be able to speak for him. Now, Bass Reeves, as I mentioned before, knew the languages, so he already had a lot of those connections, so he didn't necessarily need a Native American sidekick. However, he does as a lawman, after he loses his right-hand man as Posseman in a shootout. He does hire someone of Native American descent who helps him out a number of times. And I think Bass Reeves's connection with Native Americans, his history with them, and with that one Posseman that he mentored, I think that legitimizes the Lone Ranger connection as well. So the mask, his skin, his own pigment, using that to blend in, the disguises he incorporated, that all fits the Lone Ranger as well. So all that to say, well, if he didn't, you know, literally inspire the Lone Ranger, he was the Lone Ranger before anybody conceived of the Lone Ranger. He was it, you know?
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, you know how you read things, you're like, so how credible is this? Because when I was a little girl, and I'm dating myself here, I remember it coming on in black and white, Lone Ranger and Tonto. And I love that show. And not in a million years would I have ever thought that it could have been based on an African-American former enslaved person. That was beyond fabulous. So I know you've prepared some things, some chapters you wanted to read. You want to take a moment and hear from you?
I would love to, and that's a perfect segue, perfect timing. You're a professional, I can tell, because I was going to read something about how he uses his disguise and works his way close to outlaws so that he can possibly avoid violence. He doesn't always avoid it. It was a rough time, and he was working the most dangerous, the largest federal jurisdiction in American history, still to this day, about 75,000 square miles. That's what Indian Territory was. And because the light horse police, the Indian police, didn't have the authority to arrest anyone other than the Native Americans within their nation, they couldn't arrest some outlaw who came, you know, a white outlaw who from Kansas, who was hiding out in Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee light horse couldn't arrest him. They couldn't touch him. So that's why somebody like Bass Reeves had to be hired to go in there and try to root them out.
Okay.
So I'm going to read this excerpt from Hell on the Border. And he arrested this infamous character, Jim Webb, and he posted bail, in a high bail at that time, $17,000. This was a wanted man, but he had connections. So he ended up not showing up for his hearing. So Bass Reeves has to go out and try to track him down again. But this, what I'm going to read, is about his first time when he arrests him. To arrest Webb the first time, he had woken before sunup, before anyone else, and pulled out his straight razor and a triangular shard of saloon mirror he had picked up years earlier after a brawl, and shaved the itch off in the firelight. He'd no longer be a tramp on the run, who he'd needed to be to arrest Thomas and Wayne Coldiron. He'd now be a traveling cowboy with his traveling cowboy companion, so he could afford a little comfort. He'd still have his unwieldy mustache and the freckles peppering his light brown cheeks, so his face would be clean but not too clean. He'd have the look rather of a distinguished derelict, somebody with nothing to steal, and someone with nothing to steal was no one to bother with and no one to fear. This same look he wore at home and took to church. Wearing denims and dusty boots, he buttoned his leather cuffs, buckled his gun belt with both pistol handles pointing forward, and put on his black coat and black 10-gallon Stetson. If Jenny, that's his wife, were there sitting on a rock or log, she would go on about how good looking he was and would hug and kiss him. Her hands wouldn't leave him. Of all his disguises, the cowboy was easily her favorite, while his was easily the tramp, even if the shoes weren't worth anything for walking a country mile in. He liked remembering when he was broke and had nothing. He liked knowing he wasn't anymore, and he liked knowing people underestimated him. He liked coming from behind, being the salt of the earth. He felt most like Jesus then. As a cowboy, he felt most like God. He would have to remind himself he wasn't. In the left pocket of his coat, he carried a Sheffield Bowie knife in a buckskin sheath. When he carried it, he always carried it in his left pocket, so he'd always know where it was, just as he always kept his rifle scabbard slung on the right side of his saddle, his catch ropes on the left side, and his revolvers always holstered handles forward for a cross draw. Not only so briars and underbrush couldn't snatch a trigger and shoot his horse dead beneath him, but so he could always expect his pistols to be where he reached. Unless he had reason under cover to alter a pattern, he preserved it always his weapons in the same locations. Willie fried potatoes and boiled coffee, and still before sunup, Bass and Floyd's his posseman, a white man he's hired, and Floyd were mounting their horses. The Washington McClish Ranch was one of the oldest and largest and most profitable ranches in the territory, owing to Dick McClish's Chickasaw ancestry and political connections, and the ranch's convenient location a few miles northeast of the Chisholm Trail's main entry from Red River Station, Texas. Moving herds east of Texas had been a boon ever since the end of the Civil War. A steer that sold locally in Texas for $5 could collect as much as 40 in the northeastern markets, and the Chisholm Trail took most of them up to the rails in Abilene, Kansas. To move the herds, the Washington McClish Ranch hired up to 50 cowboys at any given time, and Webb's reputation as a foreman was that he ruled them ruthlessly with his fists. To protect his cattle and their grazing land, he was willing to do anything, even kill his neighbor, a black circuit preacher, for allowing a small grass fire to get out of hand and cross property lines. The duty Bass had been charged with was one of the more extraordinary developments of his 45 years. Here he was, Judge Parker's most trusted deputy, a black deputy, pursuing the arrest of a prominent white man for killing a black man. And I'll add, he has with him a white man, that's beneath him as his help. This is true here. That's what's amazing. This is true. This is fiction, but the story itself is not. Times have changed, all right along with the rising value of beef. According to the description the victim's wife had telegraphed the court Webb stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, had dark sun-baked skin with deep vertical wrinkles in his cheeks that looked like scars, and typically rode a bay gelding with another bay gelding in tow. Bass recognized the spare horse as an old strategy among Indians avoiding capture. Once you exhausted one horse, you could change onto the fresh one and easily elude your captors on their own exhausted horses. So Bass took precautions against Webb's precaution, planning to catch up with Webb off his saddle at the ranch house during breakfast. Floyd rode beside him on a gray mare. He chewed tobacco and slouched his shoulders. They rarely spoke this early, not until the morning behind them had caught up to the west in front of them, but by then they were almost at the ranch. "We'll ask for breakfast," Bass said. "Makes sense," Floyd said. They arrived at 8 o'clock, the overlapping WM brand carved into the cross post of the white gate. Cowboys were already out in the open pastures herding cattle into separate pens for branding and castrating, while flocks of red-winged blackbirds feeding on grass seed picked up like cyclones, one after the other, and resettled out of the way. A dirt path rutted by wagon wheels led to a log ranch house with the bunkhouse and dining hall connected by a long dog run where 3 men sat on shadowed benches. Across from the ranch house, beside a barn, a blacksmith pounded iron in his shop. "Hope we ain't too late," Floyd said. "I'm starting to get hungry." Bass surveyed the pastures once more as if merely wiping his face on his sleeve. He prayed those cowboys minding their work kept minding their work. There were a lot of them. He admitted, "A sausage patty sound good, don't it?" Floyd said. They dismounted, tied their horses to the rail outside the barn, and walked toward the ranch house. The blacksmith's hammer behind them was steady, and their steps fell into its rhythm. 2 of the 3 men in the dog run rose to their feet, arms casually hanging by their sides, pistols in their right hands. Midway in the road, Bass held up a hand in peace, still unable to see any face well enough yet, but race-wise and size-wise, they could all be Jim Webb. The blacksmith paused in his work. "Morning," Bass said. "Howdy," Floyd said. The man standing on the right nodded his head, but no one in the dog run spoke. Bass stopped at the base of the porch steps and removed his hat. Now he could see the man on the right had black furrows in his sun-leathered face, like he'd been swiped twice by a panther. The man on the left was just the man on the left. "We a bit far from where we got to go today," Bass said, "so we was wondering if it wouldn't be too much trouble to oblige you for a little something to eat for me and my buddy Floyd here." Webb on the right tipped his head. "Where's a bit far?" His voice was deeper and raspier than Bass had expected from a man his size, as if he'd once survived a hanging. "Got ranch work in Montague," Bass said. "My oldest there. Thought we might meet up." Webb's small gray eyes looked away toward the barn, toward the blacksmith, who was now hammering again. Then he motioned with his pistol for Bass and Floyd to step up, and Webb backed away, telling the man seated on the bench to cook them up something. The other man whose pistol hung by his side followed Bass and Floyd under the roof of the dog run. The door to the dining hall was propped open by a limestone brick, like the limestone bricks mortared in the rear kitchen chimney. The cook went through first, followed by Bass and Floyd, and by the 2 with their guns drawn. "We appreciate this," Bass said. "Sure do," Floyd said. Bass dipped his hand into his pocket and slapped a silver dollar on the nearest table before pulling out a chair and sitting. "We aim to pay, though. We ain't broke. We ain't begging." Webb shook his head. "Really, we want to," Bass said, "or I want to." He smiled. "My friend here don't care." Floyd shrugged. "Free or not, it'll taste the same. Am I right?" Webb shook his head. "Free always tastes better." At the end of the table, he pulled out a chair, and his friend did the same. His friend had a half-smoked cigar tucked behind his ear. He was the only one in the room not wearing a hat, the only one with a beard, the only one who hadn't spoken yet. Y'all got a big ranch, Bass said. Is one of you Washington or McLish? Shit, Webb said. You McWish, huh? Floyd said. He laughed and elbowed Bass, and Bass smirked at Webb and Webb's friend, and Webb's friend smirked back. Webb's friend propped his feet in the seat of the chair beside him and nodded. That's a good one, he said. Webb continued to eye Bass with suspicion. You know, since this is going to take a little while, Bass said, I should go on feed the horses. You don't mind, do you? Webb didn't blink. He shook his head. Cornmeal's free too, he said. Suit yourself, Bass said. He stood up, plucked a silver dollar off the table, and heard Webb stand up and strike his boot heels across the floor behind him. Webb followed from a distance as Bass unhitched the reins from the rail and led the horses into the barn. Webb waited at the barn door while Bass stalled them and loosened their saddle girths and filled their feed troughs. Bass even removed his Winchester from the saddle scabbard and leaned it against the corn crib, hoping to convince Webb to trust him, that he meant him no harm. Bass strode the length of the barn with a smile while Webb stood his ground in the light of the doorway with the squared stance of a man ready to raise his weapon and fire. At any movement of Webb's right hand and barrel motion, Bass could dive off in the hay and draw later. That would be his best option. With each step he took, that Webb didn't move aside from his stance, Bass was ready to dive off in the hay, beneath a wagon, beneath a horse, behind a stall door, behind a saddle. He was ready to dive off when the cook called out from the ranch house that breakfast was ready. Bass was ready. I'm going to pause here because I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter. I want you to think about our present situation. You think about how frightful it appears that the common policeman is, that any smell or hint of danger, let's resort to violence and let's shoot to kill instantly. Oh, there's a kid in a playground. He might have a real gun. It might not be a toy. Let's shoot to kill. Here's a man putting his life in danger because he doesn't want to take somebody's life if it's not warranted. He's going to wait. Maybe people shouldn't wait this long, but I just thought, here he is. Go ahead. You want to say something, Kristee?
I was going to ask you about when you look at Bass Reeves policing and you look at policing today, although I know it's more neighborhood policing or whatever, but the idea that he took great strides, he took great effort in avoiding violence. And that was something I noticed throughout the book.
He was confident.
Yeah, he was very confident. He put himself in danger to avoid hurting other people. And when you compare it to today's culture, just a week or two ago, another young man murdered by the police.
Right.
They were afraid.
Absolutely. They don't have the confidence. They don't have the righteousness, a backbone of something that seems noble, whether it's faith, whether it's decency from an upbringing. I don't know. They're lacking something. But here, you're right. Here he is putting himself in danger, but he is so confident in himself that he can survive the risk, and that he can still outsmart and outmaneuver his opponent, that he's that well trained. And it probably goes to training too about police, that he's so well trained that he's not afraid. He's not making decisions out of fear. If you're afraid, of course your decisions are not going to be good ones. You know, you can't make decisions out of fear.
Right.
You need to be calm. And so here he is, like here, he's trying his best to make Jim Webb relax so he can arrest him without resorting to violence. He's trying to put Jim Webb at ease. Why police don't try to put, their suspects, so to speak, at ease instead of quickly resorting to this fearful knee-jerk reaction is beyond me. We shouldn't be putting up with it. And one reason why I wanted to tell this story, I was thinking about this while I'm writing too, is imagine the kind of world we could be living in if Bass Reeves's history hadn't been whitewashed. If we had grown up hearing about this proud, heroic Black man, lawman of the Wild West, the greatest lawman there ever was, who didn't resort to violence, who was this, who preferred to arrest whenever possible, maybe white people in this country wouldn't think that the Black skin is automatically on the opposite side of the law, is automatically dangerous, automatically poses a threat, because in the back of our head we'd always have, but there was Bass Reeves. There was Bass Reeves. Right. I just feel like maybe, I'm wrong here. I just feel like we are missing out. There's a reason why some people like him get whitewashed from history, because he deconstructs the lies that have been told about Black people as being inferior, or as being animalistic from Africa without any, faith or sense of decency. It's ridiculous. It's all lies. And so anything that comes up that's gonna cause you to scrutinize those lies, let's wipe them out. Wipe them out. Let's do what we can. And that's the shame. That's why I felt so obligated to write this. But if you don't mind, I'll continue this scene, and then can we continue this conversation?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you. That's all right. So I felt like I had to mention it because I was thinking Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, and I just had to stop. He was ready to dive off when the cook called out from the ranch house that breakfast was ready. Bass was ready. Music to my big ears, he said to Webb. At point blank range, too close now to Webb for Bass to dive off. Webb's best chance to kill him. Webb stepped back and let him pass. Bass crossed the road and took the porch steps, but Webb was slow to follow, his footsteps mute in the dust. When Bass entered the dining hall, he found Floyd eating from a plate of scrambled eggs and brains, and Webb's friend still sitting where he'd been sitting, his pistol still in his hand but held listlessly in his lap. As Bass sat down, he saw in the mirror across the room that Webb had taken a seat on one of the benches in the dog run. Bass sighed and dropped into his chair. Looks good, don't it? Uh-huh, Floyd said without raising his head. Bass said a silent prayer as he pulled his plate closer to him. He glanced again at Webb in the mirror as he chewed his first bite. What he'd done with the horses by unpreparing them for chase must have gone a long way to convince Webb he really meant no harm. Cully, Webb barked. Webb's friend Cully slid his boots off the chair they were propped in, scraped his chair back, and scuffed out. Floyd kept eating, and so did Bass, but Bass ate with his head up, watching Cully in the mirror pass through the open door and join Webb on the bench. Webb whispered, and Cully leaned in. Bass looked toward the kitchen for the cook, but the cook was gone. He reached for his cup of coffee, and Webb was gesturing toward Bass and Floyd with wider eyes and a lift of his hand. When I signal, Bass whispered, and he made a sucking sound through his teeth. You take Cully, I'll jump Webb. Floyd laid his fork on his empty plate, then sucked his teeth in confirmation. Webb and Cully didn't appear to hear them, but they were settling down, no longer gesturing or whispering, both quietly facing the backs of Bass and Floyd. Bass picked up his fork again. The brains were bland. He preferred them seasoned with peppers and onions. Webb and Cully hadn't moved in some time. Floyd leaned on his elbow, sipped his coffee. Bass finally put his fork down and reached for his cup once more and took a sip. Pretty good eats, Floyd said. Bass swished the coffee around his mouth as a rinse and swallowed Yeah, pretty good for free. He wiped his mouth and mustache on his sleeves, first the left side on his left sleeve, then the right on his right, then rubbed his hands on his pants legs to make sure they were dry and quick and wouldn't slip. Floyd slid his chair back. Bass glanced at the mirror as he stood and turned, and it was as if Webb and Cully were statues of cowboys sitting on a bench. These were the moments Bass lived for, as if the moments themselves cracked open their yokes, and in that slow time there was nothing but energy, the energy of goodwill and evil intentions bucking like mustangs on a level field. When God allowed him to hear and see and feel what God did, he stepped out first into the dog run and patted his stomach, a small excuse to have a hand so close to gripping his six-shooter. Much obliged, gentlemen, he said. Much obliged. Webb nodded stiffly, his small eyes bulging, more blue now than gray. Bass could see he was ready to do anything, shoot a man in the back, any man, to get rid of his fear and feel right again. Bass crossed the dog run and sat down on the second bench against the bunkhouse wall on the end closer to Webb. Floyd sat on the opposite end. Bass looked over at Webb. If y'all ever looking for good help, he said. Webb nodded through a delayed pause. When he spoke with a forced evenness. I make room for good help. Bass nodded. Good to know. Yep, Floyd said. Cully struck a match on the sole of his boot and stoked up his cigar. By the length of time the blacksmith had hammered without a break, Bass wondered if he was forging something long and useful for himself like tongs. You know, on second thought, Webb said. He stood from his bench, his revolver still in his right hand by his side. He walked over to Bass, who was still patting his stomach, and stopped in front of him. If you don't mind, Webb said, I think I will have that silver dollar. Bass looked at Webb with steady eyes. Course, he said, but without moving his hand from his stomach to retrieve it. I got more than one, though. How many you want? Cully stood up and walked around Webb, his revolver also in his right hand by his side. He stopped in front of Floyd, his cigar tucked in the corner of his mouth. Bass smiled. I always keep a few dollars on me because my baby girls love them, just love them. I give them one every time I come home. My boy likes things like a saddle or a gun or something, but my girls, now they have a thing for silver, really do. Of course, they're younger. Just one, Webb said. He gazed at Bass, and Bass nodded but didn't move yet to retrieve it. If you're going to work for me someday, I can't let you believe I'm a pushover. The one's enough. Now, come on, Bass laughed. Webb's eyes were locked on him while Cully's darted back and forth between Bass and Floyd, leaving Bass with no opportunity to suck his teeth. Who would take you for a pushover, he said. You seem fair, but you seem tough. No, sir, no pushover. Not like me with my young'uns. That's why I'm still traveling all the time like a damn young man. I should be settled down on my own farm, raising cattle and growing cantaloupes and corn and such, you know? You know what I'm talking about, right? You giving me that dollar? Webb said. Bass stilled his hand on his stomach. The blacksmith had stopped hammering. A sulphurous hiss of yellow pig iron, cooling in tub water, carried across the air, and Bass believed he could smell it. I know you ain't asking for more than the one, Bass said, but I want to give you more than it. I want to give you some advice. Webb's muscles constricted throughout his whole body so that he looked an inch shorter. Bass glanced at Cully, his brown eyes as hard and small as rusted nail heads, his cigar forgotten in the corner of his mouth. These two clearly thought his advice was a warning of violence. Bass returned his attention to Webb and paused for a breath. Ever fed your horses on ripe cantaloupe? He smiled, instantly seeing the letdown in Webb's eyes. Gives them a burst of energy like nothing else. Better than cornmeal even. No joke, and happy? Man, I'm telling you, happy. A cough from the road almost startled Bass into turning. Then Webb turned, his jerked profile an opportunity, so Bass lunged. With no time for signals, he grabbed the barrel of Webb's pistol and wrenched it out of his hand, flinging it clattering onto the porch and thrusting his left hand around Webb's throat, wrapped completely around it like a bandana, choking him as he whipped out his Colt with his right hand and jammed the muzzle against Webb's clenched left eye. Webb burbled sounds of giving up. Bass held firm and looked away to see how Floyd was handling Cully, but Floyd hadn't moved at all from the bench. His weapon was still holstered, while Cully's was raised, aimed high at Bass's head. And I'll stop there. So that's how the account actually went. It's kind of an intense little moment, but I hope you enjoyed that. And if you want to return to our discussion earlier, we can, Kristee, or take questions, whatever you want to do.
Okay. One of the things that I noticed in the books was it appeared to me, and then we're going to take questions, but this is something I meant to ask earlier and I didn't get to it. Is it documented, or did you get an understanding that Bass Reeves sometimes struggled with his spirituality or his religion? Because I noticed in some of the writing that he believed, but he didn't believe, or he didn't trust, or he didn't believe on a certain level or something. It was just, there was something in his belief system that caused me to question a little bit of it.
He was a faithful man. He considered himself devout,
Okay.
and he often went to church. And when he was in town, when he was home, he would go. He actually arrested his own preacher. I mean, Bass had a steady ethic. If you do wrong, you deserve punishment. It doesn't matter who you are.
Okay.
And now he does think about, he does question, not like, I guess I don't mean for him to question, does God exist or anything that big, but he kind of questions some of the smaller details.
Okay.
In terms of how to apply that to his rough world is how I mean it to be. So like when he says, I've got to remind myself that I'm not God, not that he wants to supplant God, but it's so easy in his world to take life in his own hands and make decisions that maybe should be God's.
Okay.
And I think that's what he's careful about. He wants to be good in this awful world, that's good at times, but awfully nasty and filled with evil. And one reason why he wanted to arrest whenever he could is he wanted to proselytize to them. He wanted to witness. So in camp, and I showed this in a scene in Hell on the Border, he gives a little sermon. So he likes to bring up faith. And I'll tell you, as a little side note, that I had an agent who was waiting for my books. I had her for some time, and she was waiting patiently for it, a prominent agent in New York. And when she read my book, she wrote back and said, "I'm sorry, I can't represent this." She said, it's too religious. There are too many references to God, that she was afraid that it would rub like a larger audience the wrong way. And it's like, well, this is historical fiction. My character thinks about religion. I don't try to have it dominated so that I'm not allowed to show the ugly part of life. I don't let it, I hope that I'm not letting it distort the story, but he was a religious man and thinks about faith and has questions and beliefs and shares them sometimes. And I wasn't about to take that out to just so a New York publisher might like the book better. But that's the kind of thinking there is out there that I feel like we have to watch out for.
We do. There's 3 questions, but I wanted to get to the Black Lives Matters and the policing. I wanted to get back to that. You spoke of fear Do you think it is fear that causes the problems that we have in today's society, or do you think it's a lack of humanity? One of the things that you notice with Bass Reeves is that he considered they were humans. He never questioned who they were as people or human beings. They had just broken the law and he was just going to do his job.
Right.
But within a circle or within a means of, I want to take this person alive. I want to do it with the least amount of harm. And I think now when you look at Black people and policing, there's no humanity. Because if you look at it, when they arrest police officers, arrest mass murderers who are white, they take them in with no incident. But a basic traffic stop turns into a murder scene.
I love your questions. They're so thoughtful. I appreciate that. I think your point is right. It is a question of, do they lack humanity? And it's like, how do you train someone? You can't train someone in 6 months or a year to go out on the streets if if they have no basic understanding of the value of human life, regardless of race. So is it fear? I mean, I think the lack of humanity may be the root cause, right? And so when they're in proximity to someone that they don't understand, that they value less because they know them, because they don't know them, don't know how they think or whatever, and they assume the worst or whatever, that probably leads to the fear. So, I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing is a result of fear. They're making snap decisions because they're so frightful. And I think that is the cancer of white culture. I see it all the time from so many people that I know on TV, whatever. I mean, I know somebody might be wondering, like, why does a white guy want to write this story? And it's like, well, I think I know something about white people and about racism, and that instructs my story. I see a lot of fear, but there's also a lack of humanity, understanding of seeing others of other races, or it doesn't have to be race. It could be another nationality or a different situation they don't understand. And so they immediately click to that fearful position of, ignorance, the unknown, and I better shoot before they take my life. I think it's a combination of that, but I heed your points. Well taken.
I guess my thing with the word fear, if you're not afraid of someone who just shot up a grocery store, shot 8 people, or someone who's killed everyone in a church, how are you afraid of one human being? I guess that's why I struggle with the word fear, and I lean towards lack of humanity. That most police officers that are Caucasian don't see African Americans as human.
Well, I agree with you. And I think a lot of them are, I'm not going to say, I think there's fear across the board. But I wouldn't say all of them lack humanity, but I would say a lot of them do take an opportunity to take somebody out when they see it. I think that is part of the problem.
Right.
Here is an opportunity. Oh, I can be kind of clever, I can just say taser, taser, and I can shoot my weapon, and I can say, oh, I thought it was a taser. It was an innocent mistake. It's just a dumb girl police officer. I bet I could use this to my advantage.
I know.
Yeah.
This leads me to one of the questions in the Q&A. Jay Van Leeuwen, I think I'm saying his name correct. He says, and I'm going to read it the way he wrote it. I am also curious if you have experienced any challenges being a white author writing about an important Black American historical figure, Or has being a white author allowed you the opportunity to present and publish your series?
I appreciate, Jay. Thank you. Appreciate that question. You know, it's funny. If I ever receive pushback based on my race, it's from white people. And they're probably assuming that I have this this obsession that, you know, that I want to be the white savior, and so they jump to the white savior complex and defend Black people from me. You know, I find that Black people in general, and I know this is going to sound racist, but Black people in general typically will give me a chance, will trust me first and listen before a white person will.
Okay, that's fair.
From my experience.
And that's your experience. Jay also had another question, and I'm starting from the bottom, going to the top. He wanted to know, have you approached Morgan Freeman to potentially consider making a movie based upon your trilogy? And he noticed a film was made in 2010, and I'm curious if you've seen it, and if so, how do you think the director did presenting the character of Bass Reeves in this period of American history?
All right, so I have tried to reach out to Morgan Freeman. My publisher sent him my books, and however, he is under an obligation. He has a contractual agreement with a screenwriter, who's white, by the way, a screenwriter, and they were supposed to put together an HBO series on Bass Reeves that was supposed to come out a couple of years ago. You know, I thought my first book on Bass Reeves was going to come out a number of years ago too. I've been working on this trilogy now for 11 years. It took me so long because his story was so long and had so many different arcs, so many different accomplishments, that I thought, well, I've got to devote a whole story to his life as being enslaved. I've got a whole story of the peak of his career before there's this questionable event. You know, there's a cliffhanger about some mistake Bass makes. And then the third book is about him tracking down his own son for murder. So, I mean, there are major events in his life, throughout his life. So I would wager that his screenwriter found some trouble, how to structure the story and tell the background and tell the story that everybody wants to hear at the peak of his career, get all that in an easy to follow HBO series. I'm betting that that's part of it. But I'm hoping that if he doesn't, Morgan Freeman does not come out with that HBO series. If you're listening, when that contract runs out, I've got 2 books, right? I've got one in the hopper, going to come out. I've got to finish it first. Going to come out next year, I think. But I would love to work with you. I'm in this because of you. You know, I would love to work with them. Have I seen the movie? I tell you, the movies about him are not about him. These are people who are trying to take advantage of Bass Reeves's name because he's starting to have a little cachet of who's this guy? You know, Black history and culture is picking up in terms of bringing to light some of these stories, some of these individuals that have been whitewashed from history. And so they throw a story together, and we've got a cowboy with a gun who's Black. Let's say his name is Bass Reeves, and they don't resemble anything about who he was. I'm not happy with the movies that, you know, they're not based on reality whatsoever, unfortunately.
You you said something that led me to a question. I was in a class, an educational class at Union University years ago, and there was a white young man in, and we were debating something dealing with history. And he made a statement that has stuck with me, and I want to see what your opinion is on it. He said, we were talking about Native Americans actually and white Americans. And he said, well, the problem is history is written from the perspective of the victors. And there was something so racist about his statement because, but there was also something so true about it. And I was conflicted. So what do you think when you look at this story that you've written and just history in general?
Okay, so there's a lot of truth to it. All right, so H.W. Harmon wrote a book in 1898. He was in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where the seat of the federal court was that Bass Reeves worked for. And there was a famous judge, the hanging judge, maybe you've heard of him, Judge Isaac Parker. And so he oversaw the work of the deputies and the marshals like Bass Reeves. Well, and the court there was closing. Isaac Parker was retiring, so he decided people are going to want to know about this. He started writing this encyclopedic book about the lawmen and the outlaws associated with Judge Parker's court, and it was going to be so thorough that it would sell well, and it did sell well. And for 100 years, this book was considered the Bible of that time period. So later historians, if they wanted to hear about a particular marshal or about Isaac Parker or some outlaw, they would look at this book. All right, this book was called Hell on the Border. All right, it's no coincidence my second book is called Hell on the Border, because I am intentionally stealing his title from him. The jail in Fort Smith was called Hell on the Border. He stole it first. That's the nickname for the jail. I call mine Hell on the Border because kind of thumbing my nose at that H.W. Harmon historian, because he made, as a victor, as a white historian, he made the decision to include all white outlaws and lawmen. If you were white, you were included. All right, so his editorial decision about the black historical figures, so he included all black outlaws, of course, right?
Right.
You're not going to leave out one of the black outlaws. And he included only the black lawmen who died in the service of their job. Okay, that's a weird criterion. So if you died, that might mean
you weren't
you didn't have as much of a story to tell. That kind of makes your story or makes your relevance smaller, like you don't overshadow the white marshals. Bass was a deputy. It's impressive they allowed black men to be deputies, but they weren't allowed to be marshals. If they had included somebody like Bass Reeves, who survived his work and was a lawman for 32 years, his story would have overshadowed everybody's work in that entire book. And I think there was a political decision to do that, not to offend the white marshals that were proud to hear and who deserved to have their stories told. But Bass deserved his story to be told too, but it would have overshadowed the truth of the others. And in that era, at that time, it was starting to get more and more racist because more and more people from the East were moving in because Oklahoma is becoming a state soon. So there's a land rush, and that brought people who weren't familiar with Native Americans, with African Americans, and they didn't want to hear about the accomplishments of Black people. So there was that going on as well in the political air at the time. So Bass Reeves got left out of that book, and that's basically why for 100 years we didn't hear about it.
Wow. The one last question, Randall Osborne. He says, "Hi, Sidney. When I attended your first presentation at Novel last year, one of the attendees asked a question that seemed to lean in the direction of how you, as a storyteller with a moral voice, navigate the inevitable tensions that arise between writing history and writing fiction. I'm struck by the platonic nature of Reeves' mission to associate justice with moral redemption and purification." And he says, good stuff. Exploration.
All right, thank you, Randall. I love you, buddy. So, I have to remind myself, like Bass had to remind himself about not to be God. I had to make choices about what to leave out, what to leave in. And before writing, I decided what were the must share details or accounts. And I then needed at times to collapse time so that there could be a narrative that you could follow. It wouldn't have long drags of where it's like you're just getting filled in with history, and it's a history lesson and it's boring. I wanted the story to stay taut, and the momentum to move the reader forward. So I had to make some decisions to make events happen a little sooner than they happened, or not refer to brothers or sisters at a certain point, or make, I thought, small editorial decisions to remain true to what was ultimately most important that we needed to know about Bass Reeves and what I needed to represent in terms of his thoughtful nature, his very creative, clever nature, his devout nature, and then working in such at an awful time. There was a lot to debate, and I'm trying to remember now what the question was, how it tied to the platonic nature of what was that?
How you tied the platonic nature of Reeves' mission to associate justice with moral redemption and purification.
So he saw them as equivalent. If you do wrong, you need to be punished. As someone who grew up enslaved, which was wrong, we shouldn't just punish people for no good reason. But he thought if you break the law, you deserve to be punished. And he took it upon himself. It became kind of holy work for him, or pure work for him, when he took it upon himself to sermonize, to try to share that somebody like him is, as a representative of Christianity, of Christ, that could give him a chance, give this person a chance, and hope that because this lawman allowed him to live and didn't just try to crush his spirit, valued his humanity, that maybe he could see that there must be a higher power that Bass Reeves represented, and change his ways, and ultimately this would lead to a better nation. He thought that too was how freedom was supposed to work. That, in a free country, you should be allowed to be arrested and pay off your debt and have a chance for redemption. That just because you get stopped for a ticket, you have a taillight out, you have an air freshener hanging from your rearview mirror, because you've done something wrong, you deserve to die if you flinch. So Bass Reeves could have used that same kind of methodology at his time. Oh, you're wearing a gun. I have a right to shoot you. And he would have had a right shoot some of these people much sooner. But he chose not to use that right as a loophole to kill people. He ultimately wanted to save them, to teach them something, even if they were going to go straight to the gallows and hang, like Jim Webb would have hanged. He still wanted to give them an opportunity to save themselves privately with faith.
Good answer, good response. Did you want to close out our session with one more read, or what do we have time for? Do we have time for one more read, or how do you want to close it out?
Well, I could make a small little note,
Okay,
I suppose.
you can treat us with that. Yes.
I'm trying to go on the fly here. Oh, I think like Bass Reeves all the time. He's in my head, and I think, what would Bass Reeves do? He'd be calm, and he would stay calm. You can figure it out. You can use your mind. You can use your creativity, assess things. I use him. He's this alter ego in my head now. I love him. How about I end on something that'll take 1 minute? Is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
I know it's long. I mean, but this isn't going to be long. I know we're going long. I'm thinking about Uncle Mosley, this character from the first book, Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves. And Bass Reeves grew up learning song, and he sings occasionally through his books because in life he was known as a storyteller, a jokester, a singer. He loved to sing. And so I thought, this kind of borders on prayer. We're talking about faith a little bit here. And he's in the slave quarters, and Uncle Mosley was not his uncle, sang a song in the dark after everyone settled down for sleep. So this might be a nice, calm way to close out. He sang low and deep as if to a baby, and verses grew longer as he went along. You gonna pick that cotton like you be told. You gonna pick that cotton till you be old. You gonna pick that cotton like they balls of snow. You gonna pick that cotton, be wishing it be cold. You gonna pick that cotton, tweet, tweet, like a little robin. You gonna pick that cotton, 'cause wings broke and you tired of sobbing.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much, everybody. Kat, Novel, Kristee Lane, everyone for showing up today. I want to say that first and foremost. This is an honor.
And I would be remiss as a bookseller if I did not say, isn't it amazing how books can help us have these necessary, candid, insightful, often difficult conversations. Books, you can, well, this was great. I appreciate both of you for just bringing the realness. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it so much. I appreciate you being here. Kristee, thank you so much for participating. You did a great job moderating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you. You were great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
And thanks to everyone who attended. We just hope you have a great rest of the weekend. And thanks for being here. Y'all have a great evening. Thanks, Sidney. Thanks, Kristee.
Thank you.
You.